Yeah, that'd be fine. Or you can even watch it the third time, you know. It's always third time's a charm, right? You can. Let's bow our heads for a word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you so much for your many blessings, and thank you for the opportunity that we have to worship today. Thank you for the meal that we just ate. And now, Lord, we just ask you to be present here in your sanctuary as Mr. Reinach shares with us some vital information, help us to really look at the current conditions of this world and the trajectory where we're going, so we can, you know, be aware of the times that we're living in. So we dedicate this time to you, and may your Spirit use Mr. Reinach for your purpose. In your precious name, amen.
Okay. Well, welcome back, everybody. We're a small group. Maybe we'll grow a little bit. You know, earlier this year, it seemed as though there was so much chaos, so much change in how our country was functioning, that I began to wonder, well, you know, from an Adventist perspective, not so much wondering from sort of a, you know, secular or policy perspective, but from an Adventist perspective, how do we make sense of all this in terms of Bible prophecy? Is any of this really relevant? And if so, why? And what sort of framework can we have to assess what's significant and what's just, you know, more corruption, more scandal, more this or that, or something that, you know, you may like or dislike or whatever, but you know, how can we have a framework of understanding? And you know, one of the sayings of Ellen White, one of the writings that I have used constantly throughout my ministry is where she says, in reference to the United States as the second beast of Revelation 13, the beast with the lamb-like horns that speaks as a dragon, her commentary was that when the United States repudiates, that's her term, repudiates, every principle of her Constitution as a Protestant and Republican government, and I forget the rest of the sentence, but the idea is that's the fulfillment of prophecy, is, you know, the abandonment of civil and religious freedom. And for the most part in my ministry, I have always focused on the issue of America as a Protestant nation and what it means to abandon, to repudiate our Protestant principles. I've spent very little time dealing with the notion that we would repudiate the Republican principles of our nation until now, because that's what we've been doing all year long in pushing back the boundaries of executive authority. And I just want to be clear at the outset. We all have our own points of view as to whether, you know, certain actions that our government takes we approve of, we think they're wise policies, or we think they're unwise policies. That's fine. We can agree or disagree. I'm not concerned with specific policies in that sense, or politics. I want to take a look from a prophetic standpoint, from an Adventist worldview. Now, in terms of the separation of church and state, the Protestant principles, as Ellen White understood them, were a free church and a free state. That the state is essentially secular and protects the religious freedom of people to worship God according to the dictates of conscience. That's what the basic Protestant principles. In the book The Great Controversy, you go back to the chapter on the protest of the princes, where the word Protestant comes from. And she writes about how the princes rejected the decrees of the empire that would restrict their religious freedom, that would restrict the preaching of the gospel or the pursuit of additional reforms and, development of doctrine. And the princes literally taking their lives and their fortunes and their kingdoms and their sacred honor, putting them on the line at risk, they wrote this document rejecting the decree, calling it a protest. And the principle of that rejection of the restriction on their religious freedom was that in matters of conscience, the majority has no power. Amen? Majority doesn't get to tell you what to believe. The state doesn't get to tell you what to believe or how to worship. Matters of conscience, the majority has no power. Well, conceptually, we have been moving away from that over the last generation. And certainly, the Christian nationalist movement that we were talking about in the sermon has rejected the very concept of separation of church and state and insists that it is actually hostile to religious freedom, when in fact it's an essential part of how we protect religious freedom. Okay? So separation of church and state has been completely philosophically abandoned, and little by little, we see chinks. The so-called wall of separation is little more than a pile of rubble today. I would say one of the most troubling developments of the last year is several states enacting state laws providing for chaplains in public schools. Anybody who knows anything about chaplaincy knows that chaplains are not really appropriate in public schools. And none of the denominations have come out and said, yeah, this is a good idea. And in fact, the people that they're hiring are not chaplains, they are evangelists, essentially. So it's, we're cutting funding for things that the kids actually need, like guidance counselors, and wanting to essentially turn the public schools and evangelize. There's also certainly a revival of laws concerning the posting of the Ten Commandments. Now, this is especially curious for us as Adventists because, of course, we've been foremost in championing respect for the Ten Commandments as part of, as part of our faith, right? But legally, when these laws are being challenged in the courts, what are the defenders of the Ten Commandment laws saying? They're saying, well, we think these should be posted because of their historical significance. Well, yeah, I suppose that they're historically significant, but that's not why they want to post them in the public schools, right? They want to post them in the public schools for their religious significance. Now, we have a word, if you take something sacred and you treat it as though it's really secular, what do we call that? What word do we use? Why is my brain not functioning? It's a desecration. It's a desecration. You take something secular and you treat it as something sacred and treat it as secular or common. It's a desecration. Now, what could be more sacred than something that God wrote with his own finger on tablets of stone? And yet to treat it as simply a significant historical document is a desecration, number one. Number two, the new covenant puts the commandments where? In our hearts, right? God wants to write his values, his way of living, because they really represent a way of life, a way of integrity, of faithfulness, right? Of devotion to God, of family integrity, of integrity in our business dealings. It's a whole way of life. God wants to shape our values and the way we live according to these commandments. He wants to write them in our hearts. Now, how do the commandments begin? Come on, guys. You've memorized these. How does the first commandment begin? No. Open up your Bible. Exodus 20. I am the Lord thy God, who hath brought thee out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Therefore. Is that important? If God hasn't delivered us from the house of bondage, can we do anything with these commandments at all? They're against us. You put them on the wall, they're against us. What are we teaching the kids when we put them on the wall? The very thing I talked about at the beginning of my sermon. God is against you. You better toe the line or else. We're teaching the kids heresy in our public schools when we put the commandments on the wall. Think about it. It's the rules. You better obey the rules. God's way is rules-based. It's performance-based. You better toe the line or else. And the or else that they're being taught within the broader culture is that God is going to torture you in the fires of hell forever and ever. So the separation of church and state keeps the government out of the business of religion, keeps the government in its own business, which is not religion. It's everything, to do with other policies. And if the Baptists or the Methodists or the Pentecostals want to teach something about the commandments that differs from what we Adventists teach, they have every right to teach it however they want, but not the right to get the school, to get the state to promote their view of things. Okay, so that movement is well underway, and they're passing these laws because they think that this Supreme Court will reverse course, and the court has shown itself willing to do that. But I don't really want to talk much today about the erosion, the repudiation of the Protestant side, of the respect for liberty of conscience and the separation of church and state. In some sense, that's all old news. That's been happening for a long time. What is new, and what is especially significant, is the destruction of the Republican principles of our country. And we're talking little r, not Republican Party. But so we need, if we're going to assess, have a framework to assess what's really important here, we've got to go back to basics. What are the key elements of our Republican system that protects our civil liberties? Well, number one, the separation of powers, not necessarily in this order. Number two, the rule of law. Separation of powers, rule of law. So we have separation of powers. And by the way, separation of powers is symbolized by those two horns. The lamb, the nation has two horns like a lamb. What makes us Christ-like is that we protect individual liberties and the dignity of every human being because we separate church and state, and we have a separation of powers that prevents the tyranny that comes from consolidating power. The whole point of the checks and balances, James Madison wrote, well, if men were angels, we wouldn't need this kind of divided government, trying to divide power among the branches of government, and not just the branches of federal government, but federal, state, and local government. Reportedly this week, after the death of Miss Good, killed by ICE agents in Minneapolis, reportedly the federal authorities are excluding the state authorities from access to the evidence. Well, that's a violation of the separation of powers. The state has the right to investigate crimes, alleged crimes committed in their jurisdiction, right? You have federal, state, and local government. So we have these divisions. Law enforcement belongs to local government, not to the military, not to the federal government. So that's another area where we have seen a violation of the separation of powers. You know, there's no way to, you know, kind of sanitize what's going on, but we have an administration that takes an unprecedented view of executive authority. In 1973, after the publication of the Pentagon Papers, there was, and the Pentagon Papers, for those who were not alive then or remember the history of that, the Pentagon Papers exposed the bad decisions that were made in the escalation of the war in Vietnam. And the many actions taken by both Johnson and Nixon without the knowledge or support of Congress. So let's go back, and so one of the things that Congress did in 1973 was to enact the War Powers Act. So this is something that's relevant this week because there's a debate about what do we call it? What did we do in Venezuela? Did we invade? Did we, was it a police action? What was it, right? Depending upon your political proclivities, you may look at it one way or the other. But the War Powers Act and the Constitution is front and center now. So you have Articles 1, 2, and 3. Article 1, the first article, addresses the powers of which branch of government, guys? Go back to your high school civics, please. Article 1. You got 3 guesses. Okay, so, people are jumping on. Article 1 is Congress. Article 2 is the executive, and Article 3 is the courts, the judiciary. Now, I was back in D.C., I don't remember exactly why, earlier last year, and I went and did the tour of the Capitol. And, there's this lovely movie that they show you, and it was a wonderful movie. There was only one thing that they said that I think was absolutely incorrect. They talked about the 3 co-equal branches of government. So, I don't know if you know who David French is, very prominent conservative lawyer. He used to be a religious freedom lawyer earlier in his career. He's now a New York Times columnist, but leading voice of Christian conservatives, but a never-Trumper, to be sure. But I'm indebted to David French, who, by the way, we interviewed on Just Liberty a while back, for reminding me that, after all, Congress has more clout than the executive because Congress can fire the president, at least in theory, right? So whoever has the power, to fire the other one, well, that's a good sign. Now the other, that they have more power. The other thing that David French pointed to, which I think is right, is who has the power to decide how we spend money? Congress, right? And Article 2 holds the president to faithfully execute the laws, not to determine what the law is, but to faithfully execute laws passed by who? By Congress. So Congress makes the laws, Congress decides how the money is to be spent, and if the president doesn't do it, they can remove him. So it's pretty clear that a functioning Congress, which we don't really have right now, but a functioning Congress has more power and authority, and that's the way our founders intended it to be, right? They didn't want a king, which leads me to another idea, which is the idea of immunity. Immunity is a very important concept in the law that those of us who are civil rights advocates, we have to deal with all the time. And it developed in the context, really, of the police abusing their power and the courts cutting them slack to excuse them from personal liability. So they developed a concept called qualified immunity, which has no basis in law. It is an invention of the courts. And I will say it's been under severe attack from both the left and the right, and probably, if the right case gets to the Supreme Court, it's going to go by the wayside. I recently briefed an issue of qualified immunity because we have a number of cases against, local government entities, and they're always claiming certain kinds of immunity. Well, I think it was 2 years ago that the Supreme Court held that the president has absolute immunity under certain circumstances, which is to say, you may recall that President Trump famously quipped when he was running for office in 2016, famously quipped that he could shoot somebody in broad daylight on Fifth Avenue and he wouldn't lose political support. Well, now it's clear that if he did that and claimed that the person that was not just a political enemy, but an enemy of the state, a terrorist, that was an official policy decision, he would have absolute immunity in that regard. Not necessarily the same for SEAL Team 6 if they got the command from the president, but he would. But this past week, Thursday, our vice president, in response to the shooting of Miss Good, he comes out and he says that the officers, the ICE agents who shot her, have absolute immunity. Absolute immunity. Now, whatever you think about the shooting itself, our law does not have any knowledge of absolute immunity. This is something that does not exist. This is something going back to the medieval kings, the concept of being above the law. They cannot be held accountable. This is not in our system of government. Absolutely not. Qualified immunity, in fairness, the doctrine of qualified immunity that does apply to the ICE officers was developed because there are gray areas where people do things in law enforcement you know, at the moment, and they may make wrong decisions, but it wasn't really clear where the boundaries were. And so the concept of qualified immunity is designed to protect individuals from financial accountability. The police department can still be held accountable, but not the individuals. They'll be protected by this qualified immunity because it wasn't entirely clear whether what they were doing was wrong, whether there was precedent that was clearly established to show that they shouldn't do this. There are exceptions where something is so clearly wrong that you don't need a precedent. There was a case that went to the Supreme Court a few years ago where the authorities, where the police were supposed to be investigating a claim of abuse, and the woman of the house was very upset by their presence, and she wanted to kneel down and pray, you know, in the stress of things, and the police prevented her from doing that, from praying. And that case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the court said, yeah, you know, you guys know better than that. You can't tell a woman not to pray. You know, that's ridiculous. You know, everybody has First Amendment rights to the free exercise of religion. You just can't do that, right? But, yeah, I could go on that direction a long time. Marshall.
Don't you feel that some of the things that is affecting what's going on in the world over the last few years has a relationship to the 1871 U.S. corporation?
Explain.
Okay. When the country was created, it was a constitutional republic.
Correct.
Okay. In 1871, they fraudulently put into effect what they call, and you can Google this, what is the 1871 corporation? The United States headed toward making it a corporation instead of a constitutional republic. In other words, in the constitutional republic, the federal government was to be small. We, the people, were the boss. Okay? The federal government was to be small. After the 1871 corporation, they started operating the United States as a corporation. And how does a corporation work? They have the head as the boss. The president of the corporation is the boss. But we're going, in the process now of going back and getting rid of the corporation, we're going back to the constitutional republic. And so all of this is kind of stirred up, you know, and a lot of people don't understand the difference and what's going on there. And so that is a big part of what is happening in the last few years.
With all respect, I don't know where you got this idea from, but there is no such thing as the U.S. being a corporation.
You could go back and you could Google it. You can
What?
read it. They put it together with the idea
If I may, Marshall.
running the Washington, D.C. as a corporation. But they expanded that to operate the whole country as a corporation, and that's where a lot of these NGOs and the shadow government has all come about in making the federal government so powerful, and we have lost our power.
So what happened after the Civil War was the passage of the 14th, 15th, and 16th Amendments. But one of the most recent developments is the attempt to virtually undo the 14th Amendment. So the 14th Amendment guarantees rights not just to citizens. Rights of due process, right, are guaranteed to persons. Now, people are persons regardless of their immigration status or documentation. And this is one of the most significant developments in the past year, is well, the other part of the 14th Amendment, of course, is that the first part says that those who are born here and subject to the jurisdiction of our laws are citizens. It clarifies who is a citizen. So you've heard the discussion about birthright citizenship. Well, you know, if misery loves company, Trump is not the first person to try to play games with what the Constitution says. His predecessor, before he left office, Biden, insisted that the Equal Rights Amendment was good law, which of course it wasn't, and whether you think it should be or not is a separate question. So, you know, Trump is certainly not the first, but the notion that there's wiggle room in birthright citizenship is laughable. It doesn't pass the laugh test factually or legally. Now, the argument, and I have looked into this, the argument about, well, how do we get rid of birthright citizenship? We say that people who came here without adequate documentation are not subject to the laws thereof, so they're part of that exclusion. But that's a ludicrous argument, because if someone without documentation were to shoot somebody in broad daylight in Fifth Avenue, you bet your sweet bippy that the authorities are going to say, you're subject to jurisdiction and we're going to lock you up. So, you know, regardless of your documentation status, immigration status, you're subject to the law. If you're going 90 miles an hour on the 101, you know, you may just get pulled over and get a speeding ticket. But you know who is not subject to the jurisdiction? Diplomats. So, true story. My younger days, when I was back in New York City, I had an apartment on 101st and West End Avenue, and I was driving a little orange Honda Civic, little two-door hatchback, you know, little tiny engine. And I got parking tickets like there was no tomorrow, and eventually my car got impounded. It cost me $1,200 in the mid-'70s or late '70s to get my car back from being impounded. That was a lot of money back then, you know, for a guy who was maybe, you know, 20, 21 years old. That was a lot of money. You know, diplomats, they come to the United Nations to represent their country, and they double park and triple park and block streets and do all kinds of things, and if they get ticketed, they just laugh at it and tear it up because they're not subject to the jurisdiction. Can't do anything about it. And if, you know, diplomat comes over from Germany or England or, you know, Botswana or, you know, Venezuela and brings his wife, or the woman brings her husband, and they have a kid who is born here at Doctors Hospital in Manhattan, guess what? The kid is not an American because the family is not subject to the jurisdiction. That's what it means. So, you know, it's a very egregious thing to say, well, you know, we're not going to honor birthright citizenship. Now, yesterday, I subscribed to The Atlantic, and one of my favorite journalists did an interview, Anna Applebaum, did an interview with a Hispanic American who was detained for 3 days by ICE in the raids that took place here in Ventura County last July. We were actually here, our family was here. We have friends who have an avocado, about 20 acres, avocado ranch outside of Moore Park. And so we were renting from them for a month to beat the heat from Arizona. Sounds like a pretty good idea, doesn't it? You know, when it's triple digits in Arizona is not 100 degrees, it's above 110. First summer I was there, we had triple digits above 110 for like 35 days straight. Okay. But I will say 100 there feels like, 70 here. It's really not bad at all. Anyway, we were only a couple of miles away from where he was detained, and he was an American citizen. But that didn't matter because, what ICE is doing is completely lawless. Now, the case was presented in federal district court in Los Angeles, not just this gentleman, but challenging how ICE was conducting raids here in Los Angeles, in Ventura County, in Santa Barbara, here in Southern California. And the federal judge found that ICE was flagrantly racially profiling, rounding up people who looked Hispanic regardless of whether they had immigration status or not. They didn't ask questions. They just, detained people and then asked questions later. They had no probable cause. So, probable cause. Is that important? Is it important that, law enforcement not just simply detain willy-nilly anybody that they feel like? That there has to be probable cause that someone, is subject to arrest or detention, right? So the court issued a preliminary injunction and basically told ICE to stop breaking the law. The government appealed it. The Supreme Court, as part of what you may have heard about what they're calling the shadow docket, they didn't hear the case on the merits, they didn't have it briefed and all of that, but they set aside the preliminary injunction, which the effect of that action said to the government, you are free to break the law until the case is over. Once it's over and, it's been fully litigated and appeals and, whatever the ruling is, you have to obey that. But right now, even though, the finding was clear that you broke the law, you can continue to do that until the case is over, which could be who knows how many years. So you have a Supreme Court complicit in in lifting boundaries against lawless behavior by our authorities. Now, does that encourage the kind of conduct we saw in Minneapolis? Yes, of course it does. And there's so much more that could be said about all of that. My post on Facebook earlier, I think Friday morning, was if you're not outraged, then what? You're asleep? You're morally defective? You're what? Because, now American citizens are being killed. We have to call it for what it is. Ms. Good was not a danger or a threat to the ICE officers. All of the video that has surfaced has been very, very clear. She was not a threat, and they shot her at point-blank range. There was
trying to run over him. You've got to remember the fraudulent activities of the Somalians in Minneapolis and the governor all tied in with it. You've got to understand that.
Marshall, you need to expand your sources of information. I've seen the videos and know she was not trying to run over them. 2 of those bullets went through the side window because the officer was standing to the side of the car.
She was trying to run
I'm not here to have an argument, okay?
You better look at your facts and get them straight.
Like I said, I'm not here to have an argument, okay? All right.
Will you be getting to a Q&A time at some point?
Yes.
Let me know when you are ready.
Okay. Separation of powers, rule of law. We have seen time after time where the executive branch has done things without constitutional authority and using the pretext of emergency as a basis. So, case in point, tariffs. The Constitution provides the power to impose tariffs, and which branch of government has that authority? Anybody? Congress. You may think the tariffs are the best thing since sliced bread, or you may be crying about the hit to your pocketbook because of rising prices. But that's not the issue here today. The issue here today is that the president unilaterally asserted a power that belongs to Congress without justification. Okay? The use of the military for law enforcement after the Civil War, Congress enacted the Posse Comitatus law. And one of the reasons they enacted it was because they were ending Reconstruction, and the southern states did not want federal troops enforcing civil rights. And that led to, several generations of legally established discrimination throughout the South, known as Jim Crow laws, right? But we have this law that says the government does not use the military for domestic law enforcement purposes. And yet we have the excuse of whether it's terrorism, or a crime wave, which is simply fact-free, to go into cities in blue states or blue cities, Portland, Chicago, Los Angeles, D.C., for domestic law enforcement. Flagrant violation of the Posse Comitatus law, of the authority given to the president. This past week, and I'll just stop with a couple of observations. So, Stephen Miller, Assistant White House Chief of Staff, was interviewed this week and basically announced what I would describe as the law of the jungle, that might makes right, and this is the way it's always been, that you exercise power, and that's the only morality. Very extreme view. Trump was interviewed by a group of New York Times reporters and recorded on the record, and they asked him after the situation in Venezuela whether, what restraints did he have on the use of military force in global affairs. Was it, say, treaties or international law, for example? And Trump's answer was, my morality. My mind is the only restraint on me. Now, this harkens back to the divine right of kings, of a time when, the word of the king was law. That there essentially is no restraint on the way that the United States will project power. No restraint whatsoever. Now, to be fair, our country has made mistakes and abused power plenty, and has been criticized at various times by the left and the right. But we've never come to the place where, this has become our policy and our ethos, is that we will, use power indiscriminately without restraint. So we are in a very, very different place. And again, I'm not debating whether our use of power in Venezuela was a good or bad thing. The one thing I think most everybody agrees on is Maduro was a bad guy, is a bad guy. Nobody really disputes that, okay? There's certainly no consensus from, the oil companies are certainly wary of whether it's a good investment to invest billions of dollars in building back up the Venezuelan oil facilities, because they don't know if they can trust the American presence and what the future will hold, and whether, Venezuela will eventually renationalize the facilities like they did when Chavez came into power. Whether this turns out to be a good or a bad thing, it's too soon to tell. And, from an Adventist prophetic perspective, that's not really the concern, is trying to judge this or that policy. But the framework that I'm proposing here is that you take a look at what's happening in terms of the rule of law and the separation of powers, because both of those things have been completely exploded. We are abandoning the rule of law, and frankly, the way our immigration policies are being practiced, it's very much like the way Germany dealt with the Jews, okay? And those of us who have studied the history of Germany, we see it so clearly. And maybe that seems like an analogy that is overused, but we are rounding up people based on their ethnicity without regard for their citizenship. And I guess I'll make one last point about how lawless this is. You know what an immigration court is? An immigration court is where people who think that they have a claim to some kind of lawful status go to try to get that claim decided, to see if the court will recognize that they have a right to be here and that they can have some documentation to show that they have status, right? Some people prevail in immigration court, and many people don't prevail. But their claims are granted due process of law. Well, we have an immigration judge, a state court judge who was arrested and charged because she objected to ICE hanging out outside the court. ICE has been going to immigration courts and detaining people who are coming out of court. Why are they in court? They're in court because their claim for status has not yet been decided. So ICE decides to decide it for themselves and to take these people and deport them without due process of law. So there was a dust-up on Facebook some time back. I got tired of people posting this meme that said, people who came to this country without due process of law shouldn't get due process when they leave. Well, that is completely illogical. It has a certain attractive ring to it, but it makes no sense. Think about it. So the premise is you have people who came to this country without proper documentation. They had no lawful right to come, and so we should toss them out without deciding whether they had a lawful right to be here or not? That's completely idiotic. How do you know if they came here illegally if they don't have some kind of due process and you decide that? You don't know. And the result of that policy, of course, is that we are deporting people who did have legal status. And in many cases, deporting them to countries that they had no connection with, many countries that they don't speak the language, don't know the culture. It's 1930s Germany all over again. And the question is, are we going to keep silent? Okay, we'll go ahead and open it up for discussion now. Go ahead.
What is wrong with Congress, whether they be Republicans or Democrats? They know right from wrong. We hope they do.
Right.
We hope they do. But how can they just go along with these things and knowing what the outcomes of all of this has potential to be, horrible potential to become?
I will grant you that the Democrats certainly have been ineffective in Congress. Marjorie Taylor Greene finally broke with Trump in the last few months, and she understood that the consequences of breaking with Trump were that she would need to resign from Congress, right? Liz Cheney found out the hard way the consequences of breaking with Trump and was not reelected, right? So the Republicans in Congress know full well that they have to go along or else their career is over.
Well, they can't get rid of everybody.
I guess that's a fact question. Dave, go ahead.
I'd like to ask a two-parter, if you'll let me.
Of course.
Here's the first half. If there was a Sunday law passed, would that require the eradication of the First Amendment? Would the First Amendment have to be amended away in order for there to be a Sunday law passed? And isn't it essentially impossible in the foreseeable climate of the future that an amendment like that could pass and get ratified by 3/4 of the states? That's my first half.
So my answer to the first question makes the second question irrelevant because, the Supreme Court already decided back in 1961 that Sunday laws are consistent with the First Amendment. When I first sensed a call to religious liberty ministry, I had not yet finished my undergraduate degree, and I was doing Bible work in Greater New York Conference with the band ministry there. And so looking around, I went up to SUNY, to the State University in New Paltz, New York, to finish up my undergraduate degree, and we had a very small history department, and my teachers knew that I was an Adventist and knew me well enough and suggested some study for me. And I did an honors thesis my second semester there on the Supreme Court's use and abuse of history. There were 4 cases consolidated in 1961 dealing with the Sunday closing laws. Justice William O. Douglas was the lone dissenter in 8-1 rulings who said that the Sunday closing laws were an unconstitutional attempt to impose religion on society. The rest basically went along with a view of history that said, well, these laws were religious to begin with, but really they're no longer religious. And so they don't violate the separation of church and state. So, no, we don't need to change existing legal doctrine of the First Amendment to have Sunday blue laws. And, this Supreme Court is very supportive of religion in certain respects that are very helpful to the work that I do. But then you have something like this where, if there were a Sunday law, let's take the scenario that we just had with the injunction issued by a district court in Los Angeles. So let's say that Congress does enact a national Sunday closing law, and somebody brings a challenge, and they find the right judge, and the judge imposes an injunction. Says, no, can't enforce the law, it's flagrantly unconstitutional, and within a matter of months, the Supreme Court could set aside that injunction and say, no, it's perfectly fine. As for amending the Constitution, I don't remember the last time we amended it. I know it's been during my lifetime. I think we raised the voting age, or lowered it to 18. And I think that was back when 18-year-olds were being drafted and sent off to, potential harm in Vietnam. So there was a impeccable logic to the voting, but it's almost impossible to amend the Constitution.
Well, let me save some time, because I wasn't talking about a Sunday closing law where the mall has to close. I'm talking about the kind of Sunday laws described in the book Great Controversy, where it's a death decree. So my second question is the one I really want to hear from you is, what would a Sunday law have to say before it would be a crisis of faith for Seventh-day Adventists? What would be the wording of the law that would be a crisis of faith for all of us sitting here? I would like to have an answer to that question.
I don't know that I can actually, draft that kind of law off the top of my head, to be perfectly frank. Years ago, I did an exercise, as I saw how the Constitution was being interpreted, I did an exercise on how a universal Sunday closing law could be drafted consistent with the Constitution that could require everybody it would mandate 6 days of labor and school, etc., and a common day of rest, and would pass muster even under a more vigorous reading of the Establishment Clause, but simply be shorn of religious language. I mean, clearly, what we're seeing in Revelation is coerced worship, right? Is worship of the beast in its image. I don't know. I don't know what that language would look like. I think that it's going to be pretty obvious when if and when it actually gets there. But again, until literally 2 days ago is when we had the first formal policy proposal from, a respected conservative organization, the Heritage Foundation, proposing that, we consider Sunday as a matter of policy, Sunday closing as a matter of policy. This is not some kind of kooky organization. Heritage is very, very prominent, very respected, top scholars, a lot of money. They're in turmoil right now because their president stood by Tucker Carlson after the interview with Nick Fuentes, which has blown up kind of the MAGA movement over the subject of anti-Semitism, because Nick Fuentes is a, kind of Aryan, Nazi-leaning kind of guy. And so, a lot of people have resigned from the Heritage Foundation, but I just, I'm not trying to, duck the question. It's a good question. I don't know what that kind of law would have to look like, but I really doubt that this Supreme Court would give it second thought in upholding it.
Well, Ellen White, 120 years ago, said, if they pass Sunday laws, then all of us Adventists should just do missionary work on Sunday.
I recall.
And D.M. Canwright said in response to that, then where's the crisis? It's not wrong to do missionary work on Sunday. I have often done missionary work on Sunday. I often go to church on Sunday morning to sing in a choir or play the bass guitar in a band. It is not wrong to do these things. Now, if there's a Sunday closing law and I'm trying to run a business, I might feel like that's a little bit unfair, but it is not a crisis of faith to me if my 7-Eleven has to close on Sunday. And so I'm trying to understand, we keep saying this is it, the end time is upon us, but nobody can answer the question, what would the Sunday law have to say before an Adventist would say this is a crisis of faith, and I may end up dying for something here? What would the law have to say before our death is a fear factor?
I don't know that, I've already said I can't answer the question, which is fair. I mean, I just can't. I'm not sure that the Bible helps us answer the question. I have often pointed out our proclivity as Adventists to ask questions the Bible doesn't answer, instead of asking what I think are the right questions, which is what are we supposed to do with the things that the Bible does tell us that we do know. And I don't mean by saying that to in any way devalue the question, because I think yours is a really good question. I just don't know if there's an answer. I tell you what, though, I will circulate that question among my colleagues and see what I come up with, because I think it's a good,
Well, Facebook is full of this kind of discussion now from a lot of religious liberty people, and I think that subliminal question is just there. What do you think is coming that is a crisis for us?
yeah. Well, I don't, yeah. No, I hear you. I hear you. Yeah.
Okay. I think we Adventists like to focus on, Sunday law, but there are two broad categories of religious persecution. Okay, the first category is people who think they are doing God's work. Okay, like Jewish leader who put Jesus to death, maybe middle-aged Christianity who persecute Christians, maybe today's theocratic radical Islam who think they are doing God's work, by shooting down airplanes and things like that. So this is one category, people who think they are doing God's work. And this is what our church tends to focus on. But there's a second category, is people who think they are God. That is like King Herod, okay? He cannot stand to have another king coming up, so he wants to kill Jesus too, but God prevent him from doing. So what I'm saying is about is today's secular dictators. You know what I'm talking. Who, you know who, but we Seventh-day Adventists doesn't want to really get into this. Yeah, maybe because we have members in those countries, so we don't want to anger those governments. Maybe that's what I think happened. But we have very little. We don't really. Yeah, we talk about Sunday laws all the time, but we don't really want to deal with the other categories of secular dictators. Recently I found out that China they passed some kind of a law. They would outlaw Christian parents from teaching or their children any kind of religion. Directly in contradiction to the Shema, the Deuteronomy chapter 6, where Moses tells the people to teach their children about all these things. So
Well, we
basically,
saw that in the Soviet Union too.
yeah, that's true. Yeah, so it's not. So we don't really want to deal with this kind of issue. Is that all? We just don't think it's a wise idea for us to be too outspoken about that.
You know, thinking more about your question, I don't know what the law would look like, but you know, one of the things that Ellen White said is that the time will come when Adventists will be accused of being enemies of law and order and bringing the judgments of God upon the land, right? So this ties in is very consistent with the thesis I was developing this morning, that the worship of the nation, the idolatrous nationalism, sees the certain religious minority as a sufficient threat that the calamities that are taking place are judgments of God and that it's blamed on these people. So we have been given some insight, I think, into the social and religious conditions that lead to the persecution. The form that the persecution takes, you know, remains unknown, okay? And I guess I've never really concerned myself with trying to figure out what form it takes, because I've been stuck on this idea of focusing on questions that, you know, what am I supposed to do? I mean, I don't know if anybody else shares this feeling, but I have more than a few folks in my circles that were like tearing our hair out thinking, what can I do? You know, what am I supposed to do? How can I make a difference with all of, you know, what's going on? I was at the American Bar Association Labor and Employment annual conference last fall, and there was a plenary session about immigration policy and law. And one of the answers to that question was, get out your cell phones and take video. And the difference, I don't even know if you all have read about Friday's shooting of two people who were Venezuelan or supposed to be Venezuelan in Portland, who were accused of being associated with the gang. There's been hardly any attention on that shooting by ICE officials. We have the official narrative about what happened, but we don't have any video. The video, I mean, there's two things that make all the difference. Miss Good is white. Okay? That makes a difference if you're white or non-white. But video makes a huge difference. And, you know, one of the things that people should get in the habit of doing. We were actually encouraged in this ABA meeting to have cameras, Pastor, at the entrances to churches. Because, you know, the policy restrictions on immigration enforcement in churches has been lifted. Now, in our Hispanic Adventist churches, in our Spanish-speaking churches, attendance is way down. People are afraid to come to church. We should be having cameras recording, you know, in the event that they're needed. The cameras make all the difference. The video makes all the difference. You know, you can't resist arrest. You can't physically block or, you know, whatever. You can say this is private property and you're not permitted on private property without a warrant. you know, and law enforcement is entitled to come and conduct, you know, law enforcement activities with probable cause or on private property with a warrant, right? But they can't just, you know, they can't just come into a church and say, oh, you look brown, you look brown, you look brown, come with us. And yet, given current policy, that could happen. You know, we are in uncharted. Look, early in 2025, our department organized and conducted a whole series of immigration rights, know your rights programs. The point of the programs was not to teach people how to break the law, okay? The point of the programs were, you know, these are the rights that we all enjoy in this country, and you should have a working knowledge, and then address, if you are an undocumented family, have you made provision for what happens if the father gets detained, and what happens to the mother or to the children? If the parents get detained, what do you do with the children? Who's going to look after them? You have to think these things through, and you have to make plans. And there's legal documents that you can execute to give people, you know, authority to take care of the kids. You know, these sorts of, we're at a point where, yeah, you have to show your papers, which is what you had to do in Germany. You had to have papers. You had to show your papers. We've never been there before. You know, I do employment law primarily, and in employment law, immigration status has never been permitted. A company can't issue discovery requests and ask about your immigration status. Court won't allow it. I remember years ago, we weren't sure that we should be representing undocumented church members. And the state civil rights agency represented one of our undocumented church members and got a nice settlement for them. And that kind of shamed me. I said, well, if the state of California can represent our members, maybe I can. Go ahead, pass the mic back.
My question is related to the fact that the Pope is an American, and he apparently, I would say, is in conflict with our president's policies. Does it have any relevance to what we are, you know, talking about now, or is mute?
I haven't quite sorted that one in my own mind. I've never been much of a Vatican watcher. You know, the modern church has become much more accommodated to the notion of a secular state and to values of universal human rights. And I think this Pope and the last one both, to be perfectly frank, their policies and their demeanor were far more Christian than a lot of other Christian Protestant leaders and all. So, you know, and that's not to, you know, in any way contradict what we understand about, you know, the historic failings of the Catholic system and our theological differences that we have with Catholicism, which, you know, are significant. I will say, since you raised the subject of the Pope, that it's long past time for Adventism to outgrow its overt anti-Catholicism. Okay? We are not against anybody. Christ is not against anybody. He died to save everybody, right? So this, and you know, one of the themes I touched on in my sermon was this us against them. That's the religion of the beast, right? You know, you have to worship the way we do, or else you're them. You're the other, and we're going to ostracize, demonize, and ultimately persecute you because you're the hated other. So if we're going to take that understanding seriously, then we have to stand up for this notion of not separating, not othering. I don't know if you've heard that used as a verb, but not dividing people based on faith, ethnicity, you know, economic status, whatever. We have all these ways of arbitrarily dividing people. And we have to stop doing that. We have to learn to see one another as brothers and sisters for whom Christ died. Right? And regardless of whether they know it or not. Right? So I think, you know, attitudinally there's a shift. Now, how do we get to where I mean, look, the prophecy talks about Protestant America forming an image, becoming like the church-state structures of the medieval papacy, right? So that's the model. And yet it also says that the deadly wound is healed, that model will be revived within Catholicism itself, I think. And within Catholic integralism, there certainly is a movement within Catholicism to revive that model. Now, whether that becomes global or really focused in the United States, you know, we don't know yet. And what will the final history of the Vatican be? You know, I don't know if we know that. The suggestion is that, you know, even with an American Pope steeped in American values of liberty and human rights, that the church will ultimately revert to its historic norms. How that's going to happen, I'm not a Vatican watcher. I can't say if that's going to happen or how. I just don't know. But I think it's a very fair question to raise. And I want to commend you guys for raising questions to stump the speaker. Go ahead and get the mic here.
So the president had... Okay. The president has a religion council of advisors and so forth, and you got Pentecostals, other Protestants, Franklin Graham, and of course our prominent Dr. Ben Carson's on that committee as well. And I was wondering if our church state council has worked closely with him in kind of representing us as a church.
So I do have some insight and ability to answer that question. What you have currently within this administration is you have the council of kind of the figureheads, if you will. You know, the likes of Ben Carson or Franklin Graham or whatever, you know, distinguished people. And so they're holding hearings on a, you know, kind of the 50,000 foot level and talking about these issues. And then you have within the Department of Justice a religious freedom task force with representatives from different agencies like the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Melissa Reed, who is an associate in the religious department at the North American Division, her father is the more well-known of the Reed family. Ed Reed published extensively. Melissa has been attending these council meetings, okay, and monitoring what's happening with the council. I had a call a few months ago and the opportunity to meet with members of the task force at the Department of Justice. And, you know, when I was here last, I told you about our win in the Supreme Court in Gerald Groff's case, the postal worker case. One of the people on the DOJ task force is a young attorney who is a graduate of Stanford Law School. And while at the law school, she worked at the Religious Liberty Clinic there on a case with me, because we've been working with the Religious Liberty Clinic at Stanford since they started about 14 years ago. We still have cases. They're taking on another appeal for us. Right now, I want to say we have, I think, just 2 cases, but now we're doing a third. No, we've got 3 cases and we're doing a 4th. Anyway, because of that connection, then, you know, I'm working closely with members of the task force and trying to get some traction on some of these issues. Very, very difficult, and especially with the closing of the government, you know, everything, the wheels are moving very, very, very slowly. I'll give you one example of just, you know, so on the one hand, just put this in context, you have an administration that says it is very pro-religion. And there are certain things that it has been doing that clearly are very, very helpful, okay? But one of the first things that happened with the whole Elon Musk fiasco was cutting off the U.S. aid funds. And guess who got a lot of those U.S. aid funds that were cut off? ADRA, World Vision, and other large organizations that are faith-based Christian organizations, and Jewish, and, you know, everything else. But, you know, who does the aid work and the development work in this world? It ain't the atheists, folks. You know, it's the faith groups that, you know, are, you know, caring for the least of these. That's who's doing it. And those funds, you know, some of you may be familiar with James Standish, who was in the General Conference Religious Liberty Department for a number of years. He's currently a lobbyist for ADRA, and he has been tearing his hair out all year trying to get contracts restored and get some of this funding restored for you know, some of ADRA's projects. You know, the cutoff of these funds means people are dying. It's just that simple. People are dying, and the amount of money is a drop in the bucket, you know, in terms of the overall. But look, we have a federal, you know, we have a federal militarized police force roaming our cities. This is not something that we have ever thought possible in the United States, that we would have our version of the Gestapo that can shoot people with impunity, that can round people up with impunity. You know, this is not an America that I recognize. It just isn't. And, you know, and it's not about, it really isn't about politics anymore. It really isn't. And I think that's important to stress. You know, a lot of people, well, I won't go there. It's just not about politics. It's really about humanity. And it's about our values as a nation. You know, Abe Lincoln was the first Republican president, right? At Gettysburg, a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that what? That all men are created equal. You know? Now, one of my ideas was we couldn't really repudiate all of this until we had at least, you know, more or less put it all into practice. So we couldn't really repudiate these fundamental principles until blacks had the right to vote, until women had the right to vote, until we passed the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act in the 1960s, and we actually put some teeth into the idea that all men and women are created equal. Well, the Supreme Court has trashed the Voting Rights Act, right? Big attacks on voting rights. The repudiation is just stunning, both in its speed and in the severity of it. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Any other thoughts, comments? I mean, I think we need to pray for our country for sure. Yes, ma'am.
I wrote it down because I might be rambling. So with all the exchanges, I thought about writing this down. As Christians, we follow Christ's example.
Amen.
Anything against it is anti-Christ. We have different thoughts, beliefs, and principles, which I believe stems from God's gift of making our own choices. In all his power, he could have struck down Satan and the 1/3 of angels that rebelled against him, but he did not. That is not his character. Anyone who dictates obedience by force and not by conscience does not represent God. So we have to stand up for what represents him.
Many years ago, when I first came to the Pacific Union, one of my mentors was the Adventist attorney Lewis Walton. He was very prominent back in the day, less so as he's gotten much older. I remember we met over at Glendale Hospital, and he kind of asked me, what the bottom line was. And I said, it's the character of God. It's that God, that God's kingdom is a kingdom of love. And Ellen White's observation, that love cannot be commanded or coerced, only by love is love awakened. And that's the heart of the matter, right? It's very, God is love. So the idea that, but see, the counterfeit is rooted in kind of a form of Calvinism that says, we're the elect, we're the chosen, we know God's will, and you don't. And by the way, since you're not of us, you were born for the fires of eternal torture. And so you don't count, we don't care what happens to you, we can persecute you, we don't want you to vote. It's very much an exclusive kind of gospel, and it completely misrepresents the character of God. Now, I had a client, I guess we settled her case maybe 2-3 years ago. African-American woman, Sabbath observer, but not an Adventist. African-American. The reason she wasn't an Adventist is because she went into an Adventist church nearby, and it was a white church, and she didn't fit in. I told her, well, there are black churches too. Maybe she's found one, maybe she hasn't, but lovely woman. And so we're getting ready for her testimony, for her deposition, and, I asked her, well, when you're asked questions about your religion, what religion are you? How do you identify yourself? And she said, I don't call myself a Christian. And I asked her, why not? She said, well, because to me, Christian is associated with the politics of white nationalists. And that's not me. So, I know I've said this before when I was here, because I've been saying this for a long time. The problem that we face, especially those of us who are white and Christian, is that those who are not churched, that we may want to see Jesus, they associate Jesus with the worst excesses, the worst corruptions of the modern church. with all of the, the corrupt, scandal-ridden televangelists and the politics and the abuse of power and all of that. And my secular friends within the legal community who are hostile to to Christianity as the dominant Christianity here in America, some of them know enough about the Bible to know that the Jesus of the American church is not the Jesus of the Sermon on the Mount, not the Jesus of the Bible. And so they're, in their rejecting the church, they're not rejecting the Jesus of the Bible, but they're rejecting something that is, power grasping and corrupt. One of my closest friends was raised Catholic, and we had a wonderful time going to visit a client in Northern California, and I took her to church with me where I was preaching. And it was the first time, she said, in years that she'd ever thought that there could be a role for church in her life. It was an Adventist church in a very redneck rural community, but our churches are multi-ethnic. And even in a place where you think, oh, this is going to be a totally MAGA kind of place, it was typical multi-ethnic Adventist church, very middle of the road in terms of politics. You had Hispanics, you had Asians, you had blacks, you had whites, a little bit of everything. So I do think that we have a challenge in presenting the real Jesus within a culture that sees a counterfeit. Now, what I've said, till I'm blue in the face is Matthew 25, I think, gives us an idea of how to do that. Because in Matthew 25, the ones who are on the right track are the ones who gave a cup of cold water to the thirsty, fed the hungry, clothed the naked, gave shelter to the immigrant, right? And all the while that they did this, they didn't realize that they were doing it to Jesus, right? So maybe we need to learn to see Jesus in others and to treat them like we would treat Jesus, if he were here. And if we learn, if our practice of how we relate to everybody, especially those that we don't really give a second thought to, maybe because we're hostile, we don't like them, or they're enemies, or just, how do you treat the people when you're at the checkout counter, or, the wait staff at the restaurant, or, people that you encounter? Are they just servants, or are they human beings? Do you treat them with thoughtfulness and kindness, or just kind of dismissive of, that they're just there to take your money or to serve you or whatever? And I think that how we relate to one another ultimately is how we get to show people what our Jesus is like, is how we internalize Jesus loves us, how do we love one another? I think that's a good note to close on. So, Dave, why don't you have prayer for us to close?